organization, named Kamal el-Malik, was supervising the clearing of rubble from the southern side of the Great Pyramid at Giza when one of his workers hit something solid under the limestone pavement. Music, the block under the surface, was not ordinary fill. It was a sealed slab, one of 41 fitted limestone blocks, placed end to end across the bedrock floor, covering a trench that Music had been cut into the plateau with extraordinary precision. The trench ran 51 m from east Music to west, and was about 5 m wide. The blocks covering it had been sealed with gypsum mortar about Music 4500 years ago, during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu, second ruler of the 4th dynasty, builder of the largest stone structure ever made by human hands. Nothing had broken the seal Music in all the time between then and now. El-Malik understood what he was looking at. The Giza Plateau had been surveyed, studied, and excavated for more than a century by the time his crew uncovered those blocks. The pyramid itself had been measured down to millimeters. The causeways, the mortuary temples, the smaller structures surrounding the main complex, all of it had been recorded in the growing literature of Egyptology. But the southern side of the pyramid had not revealed this. There were known to be boat pits at Music Giza, shallow rectangular cuttings in the bedrock near earlier pyramid complexes, but they were empty, stripped in Music ancient times. No one working on the plateau in 1954 had reason to expect that a sealed chamber of this size had survived Music untouched beneath the pavement for 45 centuries. El-Malik asked for permission to open one of the limestone slabs. Music, the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, approved. On May 26, 1954, workers removed one block from the center of the row. The air that rose through the gap had been trapped there since the Old Kingdom. El-Malik later described catching its smell. Cedar, he said. The smell of ancient wood preserved in sealed conditions under the desert floor. Inside the pit, visible by lamplight through the gap in the pavement, were the parts of a vessel, not the scattered remains of something that had fallen apart over time, not fragments. A complete ship taken apart and stacked in careful layers inside a trench that had been cut exactly to hold it. The vessel had been taken apart into 1224 separate pieces, planks, beams, oars, ropes, a wooden canopy, and arranged in tresse layers. The largest parts were at the bottom, the smallest and most fragile at the top, protected from the weight of what lay above them by the way the arrangement had been planned before the pit was sealed. The order of the deposit was not accidental preservation. It was deliberate. Someone had known exactly what they were doing when they placed those pieces in that order and mortared the limestone blocks into place above them. The cedar planks at the bottom of the pit were still whole after 45 centuries. The ropes that had tied the hull together during the vessel's working life were still flexible. The wood had not turned to stone. It had survived because the sealed limestone trench had kept a stable environment below the plateau surface. Music protecting the organic material from the moisture, changes in temperature, and biological activity that destroy wood over archaeological timescales. The pit worked like a climate-controlled vault, not by accident, but because the Old Kingdom craftsmen who sealed it understood that sealed limestone over dry bedrock would preserve what was placed inside. What El-Malik had found was a royal vessel from the 4th dynasty. It would take most of 14 years to document, remove, and preserve the 1224 pieces before reconstruction could begin. The pit was left sealed during that time, its contents undisturbed, while Egyptologists worked through the methodical and practical questions that a discovery of this size required. The second pit, visible in survey data beside the first, Music, was left closed. It would remain that way for decades. The questions it raised could not yet be answered with the tools available. In 1954, and the Antiquities Organization made the decision that a closed pit preserves what is inside it better than an open one. The 1224 pieces of the vessel that Kamal el-Malik's crew uncovered in 1954 gave Egyptian conservators a problem with no earlier example in the field. No one had ever tried to rebuild an object of this age, this size, and this complexity from parts that had been deliberately taken apart before burial. The ship had not collapsed. It had not broken down into fragments that needed to be mapped and fitted together. It had been taken apart by people who knew exactly what they were doing, stored in a sequence that reflected the logic of the vessel itself, and sealed underground for 45 centuries. The task facing the conservation team was not rebuilding from damage, It was rebuilding from deliberate disassembly, which meant that somewhere inside the arrangement of those 224 pieces was the original logic of the builders, preserved in the order they had chosen when they placed the parts in the pit. The man chosen to lead that work was Ahmed Yusuf Mustafa, an Egyptian restorer employed by the Antiquities Organization who had spent his career working on wooden objects recovered from pharaonic tombs. He began with documentation. Every piece was photographed, numbered, and catalogued before anything was moved. The ropes found in the pit, bundles of halfa grass and papyrus fiber, were still intact, which told Mustafa something important. The vessel had been tied together, not nailed. Egyptian shipbuilding in the Old Kingdom did not use metal fastenings to join hull planks. The planks were fitted edge to edge with mortise and tenon joints, then bound with rope threaded through inner channels cut into the wood. When the lashing was tightened, the hull became rigid. When it was loosened, the entire vessel could be taken apart into its separate pieces without music damaging any single part. This was not a ship that had been broken apart. It was a ship that had been engineered to come apart and to go back together. The cedar used for the hull planks had been imported. Egypt in the Old Kingdom had no forests large enough to produce timber of that length and straightness. The cedar came from the Levantine coast, from the mountain forests of what is now Lebanon, carried by sea to the Nile Delta, and then overland to Giza. The longest planks in the pit measured more than 23 m, moving timber of that size across the Mediterranean, and then across the Egyptian interior to the plateau at Giza, required an organizational system that the 4th dynasty clearly possessed, even though the records of the transactions involved have not survived. What survived is the wood itself, still whole in the sealed trench, its grain and resin composition identified through analysis as Lebanese cedar, confirming the origin. Mustafa worked on the reconstruction for 14 years. The process required him to create methods that did not exist in any conservation manual, because no conservation manual had been written for a problem of this kind. He studied the mortise and tenon joints to understand the order in which they had been cut. Music. He studied the rope channels to determine which planks they connected and in what order. He examined the curve of individual planks to understand where in the hull they had once been. Music. By the time the reconstruction was finished in 1968, the vessel that emerged from those 14 years of work was a ship 53 m long and 5.5 m wide at the beam, larger than many seagoing vessels built in Egypt music centuries after Khufu's reign. It stood in the pit where it had been found because no structure existed on the plateau that could hold it. That problem would take another decade to solve. The boat museum that now stands directly south of the Great Pyramid was built in 1982, specifically to house the reconstructed vessel. The building was built around the ship, not the other way around. The climate control music systems inside keep the temperature and humidity conditions needed to stop the cedar from expanding or shrinking music in response to the desert environment outside. Visitors enter at one end and walk along raised platforms that run the length of the hull, looking down at a vessel built during the reign of a pharaoh who died about music 400 years ago, whose hull planks are still the color of living wood in certain light. The museum is built over the original pit. The ship has not moved from where El Malik's crew found it in 1954. The second pit was a different question. The second pit at Giza had been known since 1954. Music ground surveys carried out beside the excavation of the first pit detected its music presence beneath the same limestone pavement, running parallel on the same east-west music axis, sealed in the same way. Egyptian authorities made the decision that had guided responsible archaeology since the 19th century. A closed deposit preserves better than an open one, and the tools available in 1954 were not adequate to music the problem. The pit was marked, documented, and left alone. It remained sealed for 28 years while the first vessel was preserved, rebuilt, and housed. By 1982, when the boat museum opened over the first pit, the second had become one of the most carefully watched unopened deposits in Egyptology. Survey technology had advanced greatly music in the time between. Remote sensing instruments developed in part for geological prospecting were adapted for archaeological use in the 1970s, and by the early 1980s, it was possible to gather detailed information about the contents of a sealed space music without breaking the seal. A joint Egyptian-Canadian team applied these methods to the second pit beginning in 1985. What they found confirmed the ground surveys from 1954, a second vessel, taken apart and stored music in the same careful layers as the first. The cedar was intact. The ropes were present. The condition of the deposit, as far as the instruments could tell, was similar to what El Malik had found when he opened the first pit 31 years earlier. The team inserted a fiber optic probe through a small perforation in one of the limestone cover blocks in 1987 music. The camera that passed through the gap sent back images of cedar planking, stacked music in orderly rows, exactly as expected. It also showed something the survey equipment had not been able to determine: the exact condition of the wood after 3 more decades of music monitoring. The perforation itself introduced a new variable, outside air, with its different humidity and temperature, entering a music space that had been sealed since Khufu's reign. Conservators watching the data noted measurable changes in the microenvironment of the pit within hours of the probe's insertion. The argument that had kept the pit closed for 20 years returned at once. Opening the second pit was not simply an archaeological decision. It was a conservation decision, and the consequences of getting it wrong could not be undone. The formal excavation of the second pit did not begin until 2001, when a joint Egyptian-Japanese team, led by Sakuji Yoshimura of Waseda University and Yukinori Kawai, developed a protocol designed to address the conservation problem directly. The approach was methodical to a degree that earlier generations of excavators had not been required to consider. Before any cover block was moved, the team installed a climate-controlled enclosure over the entire pit area, bringing the outside environment into careful alignment with the conditions music inside. The limestone cover blocks were removed, one at a time. Each removal was preceded by atmospheric monitoring and followed by an assessment of any change in the deposit below. The excavation moved forward in weeks-long stages separated by evaluation periods. The cedar planking visible through gaps in the cover blocks, as they were removed, was in a condition that Yoshimura's team described in published reports as similar to the first vessel at the time of its discovery. Music dark, intact, structurally sound. What the second pit contained, as the excavation moved through 2013 and music into later seasons, was a second royal vessel of similar size to the first. The component count reached 1285 music pieces, slightly more than the 1224 of the first vessel. The ropes were present, the oars were present. The wooden canopy parts that had shaded the deck of the first vessel during its working life were present in the second pit as well, stacked with the same deliberate order that Ahmed Yusuf Mustafa had music spent 14 years decoding in the first. The two pits placed side by side beneath the southern side of the pyramid had held 2 complete vessels, prepared in the same way, sealed in the same way for 45 centuries. The question that the second vessel brought back, that the 2 pits together raised with a precision that a single vessel could not, was functional. What were these ships for? The answer that Egyptology had developed across a century of scholarship involved the religious and funerary architecture of the Old Kingdom, the role of solar and stellar navigation in the theology of the royal afterlife, music, and the specific relationship between Khufu's mortuary complex and the Nile floodplain 3 kilometers to the east. But the presence of 2 complete vessels, both taken apart and stored music with equal care, both preserved with equal deliberateness, introduced a question about sequence, that a single vessel left open. Were they used? Were they symbolic from the beginning? Were they built to be sailed and then retired, or built to be buried? The cedar of the first vessel carries marks consistent with water contact. The second vessel's analysis is ongoing. The question of whether the Khufu vessels were used before burial is not new to Egyptology, and it is not settled. It is, however, more precisely music-framed now than it was when El Malik opened the first pit in 1954, because the evidence available from 2 vessels, examined with 70 years of methodological development separating their discoveries, allows for a comparison that a single vessel could not support. The first vessel carries traces consistent with water exposure. The cedar planking on certain parts of the hull shows weathering patterns that would not develop in sealed underground storage. The ropes found in the pit had been repaired before burial, spliced in several places, the original fiber replaced with new material at points of wear. Ropes stored in a pit do not wear. Ropes used to lash a working hull under tension and music water do. The oars recovered from the pit show wear at the grip points consistent with handling. These are not the oars of a vessel built to be buried. They are the oars of a vessel that was used, then retired, then taken apart for storage. What the vessel was used for is where the evidence stops giving certainty and Egyptology begins giving interpretation. The funerary literature of the Old Kingdom describes the solar bark, the vessel in which the sun god Ra crossed the sky and in which the dead pharaoh was understood to travel beside Ra in the afterlife. The presence of boat pits in royal mortuary complexes at Giza and at earlier pyramid sites matches this theology. But theology and function are not the same thing. A vessel built to represent the solar bark in religious architecture did not need to be seaworthy. A vessel with repaired ropes and worn oars had been used on water. The first Khufu vessel satisfies both descriptions at the same time, which is exactly why the question of its function has not been resolved. The second vessel's analysis, led by Sakuji Yoshimura's team in collaboration with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, is ongoing. Organic residue analysis of the rope fibers is underway. Music dendrochronological samples have been taken from several planks to establish the exact felling date of the timber and whether the two vessels were built from the same shipment of cedar, which would affect whether they were built at the same time or at different points during Khufu's reign. The wood samples will also be tested for any chemical signs consistent with water exposure. Until that analysis is complete, the second vessel cannot be placed in the same functional category as the first or clearly separated from it. What the two pits together establish, no matter the function, is the scale of the organizational commitment that music produced them. The cedar that fills both pits was carried from the Levantine coast to the Nile Delta music and then overland to the Giza Plateau during the reign of a single pharaoh. The labor needed to cut, transport, and shape timber of that size, planks longer than music 23 m, cut and fitted to tolerances that allowed the vessel to music be put back together 4,500 years later without major loss of structural strength, was not incidental to the construction of the pyramid complex. It was part of it. The pit beneath the southern pavement was not an afterthought. It was cut into the bedrock. At the same time, the causeways and temple foundations were being laid, music as part of a plan that understood from the beginning that what was placed inside would need to survive. The road crew at Gansu that broke the surface over the Fangmatan tomb in 1986 was not looking for what they found. The workers who sealed the boat pits at Giza during Khufu's reign were looking for exactly this. They cut limestone to exact dimensions, mixed gypsum mortar to a specific consistency, and fitted the cover blocks with a care that the sealed environment inside the pit, stable enough to preserve organic material across 45 centuries, confirms they understood. The cedar is still there. The ropes are still there. The second vessel is still being examined, what the pits were designed to protect.